The wedding had been the kind of event the small rural town craved, something grand enough to stir gossip for months, yet respectable enough to pass the judgment of its most critical churchgoers. The preacher had always been the subject of fascination. For years he had lived alone, serving the congregation with unwavering discipline, never entertaining rumors of romance. He was seen as a man devoted only to God and his work, his private life hidden so deeply that even those closest to him admitted they knew very little. When word spread that he was to marry, it was met with a blend of surprise, curiosity, and speculation. No one had ever seen him with a woman before, and now, suddenly, there was to be a bride. The church was dressed in flowers and soft white fabric, the scent of lily hanging thick in the warm summer air. Families arrived in their Sunday best, eager to witness what they suspected was more than a simple union. Some came out of genuine joy, others to satisfy their need to pry. The bride, a young woman from the next town over, was radiant but carried an air of quiet reserve, as though she had stepped into this life with both excitement and a shadow of hesitation. The preacher stood tall at the altar, his expression calm and almost unreadable, the faintest of smiles fixed on his face as the vows were exchanged. The ceremony went flawlessly. The guests laughed, applauded, and admired the unusual pairing, whispering their opinions between hymns and speeches. To most, the couple looked perfectly matched, her gentle grace balancing his stern composure. They dined in the church hall afterward, the room filled with clinking glasses and polite conversation. He thanked the guests with careful words, speaking in the measured, deliberate tone that had carried his sermons for years. Everything about him seemed controlled, even his affection toward his new wife tender enough to be respectable, but never crossing into anything too personal in public. Viewed as the sun dipped below the horizon, the couple departed quietly. They didn't stay to dance, nor linger to mingle. Instead, they slipped away into the warm evening, heading toward the preacher's home on the far edge of town. The parsonage stood at the end of a dirt road, framed by overgrown trees that leaned inward as if guarding secrets. It was an old, weathered house with peeling paint and windows that reflected nothing but the fading light. For her, it was her first time stepping inside, and although she had imagined a place filled with warmth, the air was heavy with the smell of aging wood, faint mildew, and something she couldn't quite identify. He showed her to the bedroom, his movements slow, deliberate, as though the house itself required a certain reverence. The walls groaned with each step, the sound echoing through the stillness. There was no music, no television, no hum of modern life, only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional creak of shifting wood. She tried to shake the feeling that the house was somehow watching her, its darkened corners too deep for her eyes to settle in. The bed was old but neatly made. The furniture looked as though it had been in the family for generations, heavy and dark, with an almost oppressive presence. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling's cracked paint, she could hear faint noises. At first, she thought, it was just the house settling, the innocent shifting of old beams and nails in the cooling night air. But the sounds grew sharper, more deliberate, a soft scratching, like something moving within the walls. She told herself it was probably mice or insects, the kind of thing any country house might have. But each time she began to drift toward sleep, the scratching seemed to return, louder and closer, until she found herself staring at the wall. Her body rigid, she eventually slept, though the night was restless and filled with uneasy dreams. At one point, she thought she felt the bed move, a faint shift beneath her as if something had brushed against the frame. When she awoke at dawn, the preacher was gone from the bed, the sheets on his side cold as though he had been up for hours. The strange smell from the night before seemed stronger in the morning light, drifting faintly through the hallway. She sat up slowly, feeling the stillness of the house press against her, and realized that something about her new life was not going to be what she expected. The pale morning light spilled unevenly through the warped window frames, catching the dust that floated lazily in the air. The room felt colder than it should have, the kind of chill that didn't come from the weather, but from something deeper, something embedded in the very bones of the house. She rose from the bed, her bare feet meeting the uneven wooden floorboards that creaked under her weight. The smell that had bothered her the night before had not only lingered, it had intensified. It was no longer just the mustiness of an old home. There was something sharper in it now, something that carried a faint sourness. Like decay, she stepped into the hallway, the boards groaning as though protesting her movement. The preacher was nowhere to be seen. The silence of the house was unsettling, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty but expectant. She moved toward the kitchen, drawn by the faint clink of metal and the sound of something being moved around on the counter. He stood with his back to her, shoulders rigid, his tall frame casting a shadow that seemed larger than life in the dim morning light. His hands moved quickly over something on the cutting board, but her angle kept her from seeing what it was. She caught a glimpse of pale, glistening shapes before he reached for a cloth and covered the board entirely. There was no greeting, no explanation, just the subtle adjustment of the cloth to hide whatever he had been doing. The air in the room seemed heavier now, almost damp, as if it clung to her skin. She tried to focus on him instead of the strange unease curling in her chest. His appearance was as neat as ever, his shirt buttoned to the collar, his posture upright. But when she reached out and took his hand, she felt the coolness of his skin, unnaturally cool for someone standing in a warm kitchen. As her fingers brushed against his wrist, the cuff of his sleeve slipped back just enough to reveal a patch of skin that looked wrong. It wasn't a bruise, though at first she thought it might be. It was discolored, sunken slightly, and as she stared, she thought she saw the faintest movement beneath it. Tiny writhing shapes like something alive beneath the surface. Her breath caught, but he withdrew his hand before she could say anything. Without looking at her, he turned toward the hallway and motioned for her to follow him back to the bedroom. His movements were smooth, almost rehearsed, but there was a stiffness to them now, as if he were holding something back. The strange odor followed him, clinging to the folds of his clothes. Once back in the bedroom, he busied himself with small tasks, straightening the sheets, moving a chair slightly, checking the window latch while she sat on the edge of the bed, unsure whether to ask about what she had seen. Every time she opened her mouth, the words stuck. There was a growing sensation in her that she shouldn't ask, that pressing for answers would invite something she wasn't ready to face. As the morning wore on, she noticed other things that unsettled her. The house seemed darker than it should be, even with the curtains open. Corners held shadows that didn't seem to shift with the movement of the light. Every so often, she caught the faint scratching sound again, but now she was certain it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, and it came from different places each time, as though something were moving through the walls themselves. She spent most of the morning pretending to read a book she had brought with her, her eyes scanning the same page over and over without absorbing a single word. From the other room, she could hear him humming faintly, the same low tone repeated again and again, like a chant without words. It was steady, controlled, but not soothing. It felt more like the sound someone might make to keep themselves calm while doing something unpleasant. By midday, the preacher disappeared into what he called his study. She wandered the hallway in his absence, trying to distract herself from the knot of unease twisting in her stomach. The smell seemed to be stronger near certain walls, particularly in the back of the house, and she began to realize that it wasn't drifting from one source. It was seeping from multiple places, as though it came from the structure itself. She returned to the kitchen, drawn to the cutting board. The cloth was still there, neatly placed, but she didn't lift it. She stood staring at it for a long moment, her hands resting on the edge of the counter. The faintest sound of something Wet shifting beneath the fabric reached her ears, so faint she might have imagined it. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, and she stepped back quickly. When he finally reappeared, his presence filled the room in a way that made her pulse quicken. He smiled faintly, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Without a word, he moved past her, brushing her shoulder just enough to make her flinch. The smell clung to him more strongly now. She realized she hadn't asked a single question since she had seen the thing moving under his skin, and deep down, she knew why. Some part of her feared that the answer wouldn't just ruin the marriage, it would shatter her entirely. The rest of the day unfolded in a haze of tension. She told herself it was nothing more than the strain of adjusting to married life, the unease of moving into a home that didn't yet feel like her own. But the truth gnawed at her quietly. Something in this house wasn't right, and it had nothing to do with the furniture or the age of the walls. The preacher kept himself occupied, his movements deliberate and controlled, drifting between rooms as though following some routine she wasn't privy to. He locked the front door without explanation, sliding the deadbolt into place with a heavy click, then did the same to the back door. He spoke little, his eyes avoiding hers for just a fraction of a second longer, then seemed natural each time their gazes met. By afternoon, the sun had risen high, casting strips of light across the upstairs hallway. She wandered there, drawn to explore the parts of the house she hadn't yet seen. Each door she opened revealed rooms that felt abandoned rather than simply unused. Dust clung thick to the surfaces, and the air was stagnant, as though the spaces hadn't been touched for years. One narrow door at the end of the hallway led to a small storage closet. The hinges groaned when she pulled it open, revealing a wall lined with shelves stacked with shoeboxes, all meticulously labeled with dates in neat handwriting. Curiosity pulled her closer. She lifted one box from the shelf and eased off the lid. Inside were photographs, each one carefully tucked into protective sleeves. At first, they seemed harmless images of the preacher standing outside, the ground beneath him disturbed, as if freshly dug. The photos were all taken at night, the background dark except for the glow of a flashlight or lantern. He was always alone in the pictures, standing beside the disturbed earth with a solemn expression. She flipped through them quickly, a cold unease spreading through her as she realized the dates spanned years. She replaced the box and opened another. This one was stranger. Its contents were glass jars filled with insects, preserved in murky liquid. Each jar had a small label, handwritten with a date and a single word. Some contained beetles, others large spiders, their bodies distorted slightly from the preservation process. But one jar was different. It contained living maggots, writhing in a thick mass at the bottom. They moved against one another in slow waves, their pale bodies glistening in the dim light. The jar had no liquid inside, only a layer of soft, dark material she couldn't identify. Her stomach turned. She glanced at the other shelves, noticing more jars and boxes, some unlabeled. A faint sound caught her attention, a scratching, soft but steady, coming from behind the closet wall. It wasn't the quick, erratic movement of a mouse. It was slower, almost methodical, like something searching its way along a path it had traveled many times before. She stepped back, her pulse quickening, and closed the closet door as quietly as possible. She told herself to breathe, to keep calm. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation: old photographs, an interest in entomology, pests in the walls. But the images of the freshly dug earth clung to her mind, heavy and unshakable. It didn't help that the house seemed to respond to her thoughts, each creak and whisper of shifting wood sounding more deliberate, more aware. She retreated to the bedroom, trying to occupy herself with unpacking her belongings. The preacher passed by the doorway a few times, each time glancing in but saying nothing. His face remained calm, almost pleasant, but there was something different in his eyes now, something watchful. When she heard the faint clink of glass from another room, She thought of the jars again and felt a cold shiver run through her as the afternoon stretched toward evening. The smell in the house grew stronger. It seemed to drift from no single source, instead seeping from the walls, from beneath the floor, from the very air itself. She tried opening a window for relief, but the hinges resisted, and the frame felt swollen shut from years of disuse. The air was trapped inside, stale and heavy, pressing against her lungs. The scratching returned that night, louder than before. It seemed to come from multiple places at once, moving from one wall to another, up through the floor, even across the ceiling. She lay in bed, eyes wide, listening as it traveled around her in slow, deliberate paths. At one point, it stopped just behind the wall where the bed was pressed, so close she could almost imagine feeling the vibrations against the back of her head. Her breath caught in her throat, and she found herself holding it without realizing. Preacher, lying beside her, made no acknowledgement of the noise. He simply lay still, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady, as though the sound was as ordinary as the ticking of a clock. She didn't dare speak. Somewhere in her chest, a quiet realization was forming. Whatever was in this house, whatever moved in its walls, he knew it was there. And worse still, he was in no hurry to make it go away. The next day began with a heaviness that seemed to sink into every corner of the house. The preacher had already changed into a loose, long-sleeved shirt despite the oppressive summer heat. His movements were calm, almost methodical, but there was something strained in the way he adjusted his clothing, pulling the cuffs low over his wrists and the collar high against his neck. She noticed faint discoloration along the fabric, small streaks of something dark that had dried into the threads. When he leaned forward to pick up a chair in the dining room, the hem of his sleeve slid back, and she saw it again. The skin beneath was not only discolored, but appeared to be breaking apart in places, the surface soft and uneven, as though rotting from within. Her breath caught when a small, pale larva dropped from the gap in his sleeve, landing silently on the floor between them. It wriggled briefly before curling into itself. She froze, her stomach tightening into a knot, but he didn't react. He didn't even glance at it, as though it were nothing unusual. He straightened the chair, brushed the front of his shirt, and walked past her without a word. The faint smell that had lingered in the air since their first night was stronger now, clinging to him like a second skin. The memory of whispered rumors from the townspeople began to surface in her mind, stories she had dismissed as idle talk. Some claimed they'd seen him near the graveyard in the dead of night, shovel in hand. Others mentioned how stray animals avoided his property, darting into the road rather than crossing his yard. A few, always in hushed voices, spoke of people who had vanished over the years without explanation. She had chalked it all up to gossip born from boredom, but now, in the thick of the stale air that clung to the walls, those rumors no longer seemed far-fetched. She spent the day in a quiet, restless loop, moving from room to room without purpose. The windows refused to open, their warped frames sealed tight. The light that filtered in was dull, as though even the sun was reluctant to touch the inside of this house. She could hear him moving about, sometimes upstairs, sometimes in the rooms below, always with the same steady, deliberate pace. Every so often, a faint metallic sound would echo through the walls, the ring of metal striking something solid, followed by a dragging noise that set her teeth on edge. By late afternoon, the heat outside had risen to the point where the air shimmered in the distance, yet inside the house remained cool, not a pleasant cool, but the kind found in cellars and stone crypts. She sat in the hallway, listening to the muted thumps of his footsteps above her, until they stopped entirely. A long silence followed, broken only by the faint scratching she had heard so many times before. Now she was certain it was not the scurry of small pests but the slow, determined movement of something larger. That night, she lay in bed pretending to sleep. The preacher's breathing beside her was steady, too steady, as though it were measured. She waited until she heard the subtle shift of his weight, The creak of the bed frame, and the soft thud of his feet meeting the floor. He moved quietly, but she could follow the faint creaks as he left the room and descended the stairs. The house seemed to hold its breath with her as she strained to hear his movements. Then came the faint scraping sound again, followed by something heavier, a wet, dragging noise like a sodden cloth being pulled across the floor. Her pulse quickened. She imagined him in the dark rooms below, his hands working at something she couldn't see, something that explained the smell, the scratching, and the strange objects she had found in the closet. She wanted to get up, to follow, but her body remained frozen. Her mind conjured images she didn't want to believe, each more disturbing than the last dot when he finally returned. It was nearly dawn. His shirt was buttoned all the way to the collar, and the smell around him was suffocating. He slid into bed without a sound, his breathing slow, and even once more. She kept her eyes closed, her body rigid, pretending to be deep in sleep. But she knew, with a growing certainty that settled in her chest like a stone, that she couldn't stay here another night. Whatever he was doing in the dark hours, whatever lived in the walls, it was not something she was meant to understand only. Something she had to escape. Before the first light of day touched the sky, she rose from the bed with deliberate care, moving slowly so as not to stir the preacher beside her. His breathing was deep, almost unnatural in its rhythm, as though he had practiced it for years. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet felt deafening in the stillness. She slipped into the hallway, the air heavier than it had been even the night before. The smell was almost unbearable now, thick, sweet, and rotting, clinging to her throat until she could taste it. She moved past the locked front door, her eyes drawn instead to the narrow door at the back of the hallway. The one she had assumed led to the cellar. The handle was cold, but to her surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a slow groan, releasing a breath of damp, fetid air that seemed to wrap around her like a physical thing. She descended the stairs, each step sinking her deeper into the dark. The cellar smelled far worse than the rest of the house, the kind of odor that clung to the lungs and refused to let go. Her eyes adjusted gradually to the dim light, revealing shapes in the shadows that at first she couldn't understand. In the center of the room was a crude altar made of warped wooden boards, stained dark in places where time had deepened whatever had once been spilled there. Surrounding it were wooden crates, their lids pried loose or missing entirely. She stepped closer to the nearest one and froze. Inside lay the carcass of a large dog, its body matted with fur that had begun to slip away from the skin. Maggots writhed in thick clusters across the exposed flesh, moving in slow, hungry waves. Another crate nearby contained the remains of a goat, the eyes long gone, the skin sagging from the skull. Her stomach churned. But something in the far corner caught her attention, a wooden box larger than the rest, its lid leaning open just enough for her to see what was inside. She stepped toward it slowly, each footfall echoing in the damp air. As the opening widened, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a coffin, not sealed, not buried, but resting here in the darkness. The body inside was human, dressed in what had once been a bridal gown now stained yellow and brown with age. The skin was bloated and ruptured in places, the flesh alive with movement as maggots burrowed and surfaced, feeding in silence. She could not look away from the left hand of the corpse, where a gold wedding band still clung to the swollen finger. The meaning sank in with brutal clarity. This was not the first marriage the preacher had entered into. His first wife had never left this house, not really. She had been here the entire time, rotting in the dark beneath the floor where he now brought his second bride. The scratching in the walls, the smell that never faded, the larva that fell from his clothes, it all traced back here, to this hidden tomb he tended like a gardener to a secret diseased garden. A sudden creak above made her freeze. The faint shift of weight on the floorboards sent her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might hear it. She backed toward the stairs, moving as quietly as possible, her eyes still locked on the coffin until it slipped from view. At the top of the stairs, she eased the door shut, her fingers trembling so hard she could barely grasp the handle. She returned to the bedroom and slipped back into bed, her mind reeling, her body rigid beside him. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, she was already dressed, her belongings packed in a small bag she had hidden under the bed. She waited until he stepped into his study before she moved, unlocking the front door and stepping out into the hot, blinding daylight. By the end of that day, the divorce papers were signed. She didn't give an explanation beyond a vague claim of incompatibility. The preacher didn't fight it. He signed in silence, his face as calm and unreadable as it had been at the altar. Within days, he disappeared from the town entirely, leaving the parsonage empty. But even empty, the house wasn't silent. Those who lived nearby claimed they could still smell the rot drifting on certain nights when the wind was right. A few swore they had heard faint scratching if they passed too close after dark, as though something inside was still moving, waiting for the next time someone dared to step inside.